Yat Klee Benally Yanishe, Twitch Inchibashishchin, Nakadina Dashanella, Shama Biligana, Beafachi Dashache, Zithajinde Nasha Auto Confani Shahoan. My name is Klee Benally. I'm originally from Black Mesa on the Diné Nation, more known as Navajo. I right now reside in Flagstaff, Arizona. I'm from the Tortichini, which is a bitter water, and Nakadina, which is the wandering people. Those are my clans. I don't quite recall when I first heard of anarchism. I mean, I think a lot of young folks who go to the public education system here in the United States are exposed to, I guess, a range of subcultures when you're not necessarily fitting into dominant society's ideals, or, if you're not interested in just conforming to the mainstream norms. You get introduced to a lot of things, and I think that the first, I was introduced to anarchism was just through my friends, and mainly through music and the punk aesthetic and type of subculture. Initially, it was just an aesthetic and just sort of a symbol, a circle A that people would draw, and there, it would be used to get reaction from authority figures. So that was when I was first introduced. I remember I was in 8th grade in mid school here in the so-called U.S. And a teacher, actually an art teacher, failed me in art because that was something that I was fascinated with, was actually using sort of antagonistic symbols, like particularly anarchist symbols, and just playing with art. And the teacher set me aside and said, "This is really troubling. This is and proceeded to explain why it was problematic, and subsequently failed me in art, which was really interesting. And it was really just a sort of political attack. Today it's still challenging for me to identify as an anarchist. I really identify more with anarchists than anarchism. And that's because I first identify myself politically as a Diné traditionalist, Navajo traditionalist. And through our cultural teachings, there's a very strong, foundation of autonomy and self-determination based upon how we relate to each other in the natural environment. I mean, in our belief, there's no law, no man-made law that can be higher than the natural law. So first and foremost, we have that understanding and that relationship, that the philosophy of our way of life is based on Hojan, or the beauty way, Hojanche, which in reality, it's not an aesthetic of beauty. It's a sort of harmony, a beauty of harmony. So if your mind, your body, and your spirit, if you're balanced and that's harmonious, then you're healthy, and that projects outward, or extends outwards, that to all your relationships with your family, your environment, your community, and so forth. And within that, we have, of course, our relationship to our sacred lands, sacred sites. We have 6 sacred mountains as Diné people, 4 cardinal mountains that uphold our universe and our manifestations of our relationship to the natural law. I felt like that there was something that I could relate to based upon my more traditional upbringing and relationship to the dominant society, being that of one that's still exploiting our lands as indigenous people, that's still violating our freedoms as indigenous people, and still attempting to commit genocide against our people. So just starting to read like Noam Chomsky, starting to read primarily just zines, because I really never had good access to anarchist books, and never really was interested in paying for them. So, just like sharing zines and organizing with people, because I've been organizing since I was really young, just around social and environmental issues here in this region. So, today I feel more comfortable identifying as an anti-capitalist, as anti-colonial, as a Diné traditionalist, and in that way, I could be identified as others as an anarchist, but anarchism, it's hard to identify as an indigenous person, to anarchism, because first, it's Eurocentric. I think a lot of the history has no connection to who we are as indigenous people. And secondly, one thing that I always find interesting is when I ask the question, where's the spirit in anarchism, or how does anarchism relate to indigenous people's spirituality and spiritual practice? Then there's always interesting conflicts and discussions and dialogues. And I think that for me, that's where I'm still coming to terms with my political understanding and relationship and identification as an anarchist. When I was young and really just sort of coming to an understanding of like just the political realities that we are faced with in today's society, and engaging with the dominant culture, anarchism was one that I think I had more of an affinity with. Primarily, not really anarchism, but anarchists as they practice, and as just through discussions, and that's really relating to the self-determination, autonomy, mutual aid, and collectivism, methods of organizing that were really decentralized, that are really something that I feel in my cultural upbringing as a Dene traditionalist. I could see the commonalities being that where we come from as Dene people, we're semi-nomadic. We have no centralized type of governance, no like chiefs, no council, but different families that are clan related, or just different families that live in different areas. And we have sometimes we have head people that emerge during times of crises, like times of war, or people who help to help wage peace in some ways. But our traditional practitioners, medicine people, women or men, or Natle, which is two-spirited people, or else our elders as well, sort of help guide and facilitate our people for sort of larger collective decisions. But really, our people are guided by Hojonje, which is the beauty way. And that is our philosophy and our way of life, which guides us through the decisions we make, and is really our understanding of our existence. So we have a natural law that no man-made law can be beyond. But with this way of life, Hojonje really translates to the beauty way, or the way of harmony. And as long as our mind, our body, and our spirit are in balance and are in harmony, then we're healthy. And that extends towards our family, our community, our environment as well. We have sacred places, or sacred sites, that are direct manifestations of our relationship to our natural law. So growing up and engaging in political struggles, the people who I definitely have the most affinity with, and I can see and really witness the affinity and solidarity is with folks who identify as anarchists. And I mean, anarchism is still is hard for me to identify with because of its Eurocentrism and its lack of sort of the spiritual components that I think that are necessary as far as indigenous people, indigenous identity as well. But yeah, again, first and foremost, I think that identify as anti-capitalist, as anti-colonial, and then within that, the connections to anarchism. So about 2.5 hours from here to the north, we have one of the largest acts of forced relocation in recent U.S. history. More than 14,000 Dene people from my nation have been forcibly removed because the United States government has manipulated tribal governments and have worked with a coal company called Peabody Coal Company to access the coal underneath the land and forcibly remove people from the land. So in 1974, the United States Congress, the so-called United States Congress, passed a law, PL 93-531, effectively forcing the people to be removed from the land, from that area. My family is originally from this area, and I was born into this dispute. My family, ever since I was young, has taken me to meetings, to protests, and today there are families that are still resisting this forced relocation. So since I was very young, I was raised with that understanding that we can't rely upon the state to solve our problems, because in fact, today the state is still waging war against our people and trying to exterminate our people. So this not only history but present reality is something that's very real to me when I was growing up. So much so that our elders who are resisting forced relocation up in the areas as Big Mountain and some of the other larger areas on the area known as Black Mesa today have declared themselves as sovereign in that nation, within, rejecting the government manipulated tribal councils, rejecting, of course, the state, the so-called United States, and rejecting any other form of governance except that of our own as traditional people with the natural law. So when I was young, I was introduced to that. And through my upbringing and through interacting with other activists or other, folks with the organizing, was really sort of introduced to the basic concepts, first of just consensus, decision-making, and collectively organized any type of process, so collectivism as well. You're rejecting all forms of hierarchy and, of course, rejecting any benefit that is beyond what our current needs are. And just, the basic premises of mutual aid, just directly going out there and supporting each other and making sure that, we have each other's backs across whatever issues that we're facing, whether it's, homophobia, so addressing heteropatriarchy, addressing patriarchy directly head on as well, and just looking at ways that we can build solidarity across different movements and different communities with different oppressed peoples as well. So that way we can have meaningful support, because the government's not going to do it for us. Corporations certainly are, very powerful, very well organized, and that's something that, for a long time I've been engaged in. Everything from just, self-publishing zines, and I have a band that we started playing music back in 1989 with my brother and my sister, and with this group, we reject all mainstream music, sort of, support, and just do everything ourselves. And we've always had that sort of, it's punk rock ethic, but the band was formed initially to just address the political crises, the social environmental crises that are facing our people, and use music as a tool to struggle for justice as well. So that band's called Blackfire, and with that, we're very much based our ethics in just the sort of do-it-yourself, but beyond that, using music as a tool to effectively and strategically, address the struggles for cultural survival and indigenous peoples' self-determination, liberation as well. I've been involved with a whole bunch of different projects from different infoshops, organizing this one particularly called Taala Hooghan, which is one of the first, we believe it's one of the first infoshops that's indigenous established here in the so-called United States. And we intentionally set this info shop up back in 2007 as such, because there's this sort of problematic issue where you have first of all, we're confronting a dominant society that is based on white supremacy, and then when you look at the anarchist scenes, which a lot of them are just sort of that scenes, you see white anarchist punks, and the info shops are pretty much set up, and so whose needs are primarily being met is usually those groups of folks from those scenes. So we set this info shop to confront that. And the very name Taala Hooghan is a simple name. It just means flat top roof house, but it's beyond that. It's a name that reclaims the identity of space. So beyond just being an autonomous zone or an activist center or an anarchist center for sharing information, it's actually an action of just reclaiming the name of this space and reclaiming the identity of these occupied territories by giving it a name that is one of a sacred place that's not too far from here. And with that, the spirit of organizing here is very much of just supporting any, all people's struggles for self-determination, but first and foremost recognizing that any struggle for self-determination here can't happen without first and foremost recognizing whose land you're on, because you can be completely autonomous, but if you're on indigenous people's land as an occupying force, then you're still colonial. But there's a lot of other projects as well. I produce, publish zines just to try to get information out there, not only anarchist thought, but its struggles and issues that we face here in this region, because we're still waging battles against multinational corporations and the state in our struggles to protect our land, protect our sacred land and our culture as well. But I think right now this infoshop is probably the biggest manifestation of some of that work. It must be understood that capitalism is the enemy of Mother Earth. And, capitalism can never be sustainable. When we look at the struggles that we face as indigenous people here today, we face many issues. I mean, the United States is still waging war against our peoples. And one example is right here, just outside of Flagstaff, we have the Klee, which is known as the San Francisco Peaks, and it's one of the holy mountains, one of 6 holy mountains for us as Diné people, but it's also holy or held sacred to up to more than 13 indigenous nations from this region. A ski resort named Arizona Snowball has developed on there, and it was a battle for over 30 years to fight them, to stop them from desecrating this holy site. And today, they want to expand the development, clear cut hundreds of acres of old growth trees, and the most controversial part of the development is to make snow out of wastewater purchased from here, the city of Flagstaff. So the San Francisco Peaks are managed as quote-unquote public land by the United States Forest Service. And the Forest Service has permitted this development, saying that they've gone through the process to determine if there's going to be any impacts as they're required to by law to Native American religious practice. And they've said, oh, well, there are going to, but there's nothing in the law that says we have to stop. So from our perspective as indigenous people, this is a struggle not just to protect a sacred part of our landscape. It's a struggle to protect our cultural survival, because our identities, our cultural identity, is directly interconnected with our natural landscape. We can say that everything is sacred, but it must be understood that there are places that are set aside depending upon our traditional cultural history, our spiritual practices, and our relationship to our natural law and to creation as well. So the earth, many people say, is a resource. We have the issues of resource extraction that we face everywhere. And, it's very clear when it's gold, oil, coal, uranium, natural gas, and so forth. But in this case, with the San Francisco Peaks, the resource is recreation. So as long as our natural environment is viewed as a commodity, something that can be exploited and turned into a product and sold, then we're always going to have this conflict. So as long as the earth is viewed as a resource, we're going to have this conflict. To indigenous people, and this is not to generalize, but I think it's pretty safe to say to almost all indigenous people, the earth is not a resource, it's a source, or it's the source of our spirituality, of our identity, and beyond that, it's what nurtures us, where we plant our food. If we want clean air to breathe, which we need, then we're not going to build a coal-fired power plant and destroy our community's health and environment in our lungs. If we want clean water to drink, we're not going to accept or tolerate industrial waste polluting our rivers and our lakes and our streams, because that's where we get water from. Or we're not going to tolerate uranium mines from being built just right on our lands, because that radiation is going to go and poison our wells. We're not going to tolerate the poisoning of our land, because that's where we grow our food and that's what sustains us. So not only spiritually we're sustained by the source, our mother, the earth, but we are sustained physically as well. And that has to be understood, because nobody's separate from that. Nobody is above that. And that's why I say, that's really the natural law. No man-made law can be above that. And that's why it has to be understood when we talk about our relationship to our natural environment. Even settlers or invaders who have come here, colonizers who have come here, they're not exempt from it either, from that cycle of life, from that relationship. I mean, first, you have to understand that we're all indigenous people to somewhere. Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, South America, Central America. We're people of this earth. Unfortunately, for many thousands of years, there are people who have become removed from that relationship, and they only seek to dominate within that relationship and not to live in harmony or in balance with that relationship, and to truly understand that we're part of the cycle of life, that we can't, when we dominate it, then it becomes out of balance, and we break that cycle. So these concepts for indigenous people aren't anything new. It's what informs us and what we act upon. It's what establishes our relationship to all creation and what we act from. And we have to act from that because it's who we are. So you should probably try to ask my family more. It'd probably be more appropriate to ask them how they view me being an anarchist. But it's just, I think because we were raised working closely together, and we have a traditional foundation as far as our upbringing. My father is the hatafli, which it translates to singer, but that's what we call our medicine practitioners. And our mom is just a radical. She's always sort of been more radical than pretty much any of us. We've at times had to tell her to sort of simmer down, and she's always been very active and upfront and engaged. I don't know if they'd be surprised. I mean, really, it's a political label. Unfortunately, I think that anarchism has so many stereotypical connotations today, where it's either, if you're sort of on a surface level, people will, when they hear the word anarchism, they think of chaos and disorder and just the simple things, or the Sex Pistols, or things like that. But unfortunately, they don't go deeper than that, than the surface. So the other stereotypes, of course, being if you know a little bit, or if you've been introduced to anarchism a little bit more, then it's just like either old white people, particularly old white men, and lots of books and dusty shelves, I don't know what, or else the next step being just dreadlock, crusty, patch wearing, black clad, white, young, middle, usually rejects of their middle class, but it's like a reverse rejection of the middle class, where they've rejected their own privilege and just sort of doing their projects and food not bombs and infoshops, and usually not even that far. Sometimes just some sort of crime think inspired, get-togethers and punk shows and things like that. And not to say it's bad, but just to say, like, those are the typical stereotypes. So when I say, and I assert myself either as an anarchist or somebody who is an anarchist, has anarchist affinities, then I think that they're generally pretty supportive. I think other people in my community, it's sort of confusing, but I think the way I translate it is directly relating to that I struggle for self-determination. I struggle first and foremost to abolish the state and abolish capitalism, and that these are things that are foreign to our culture. They're foreign to these lands, and I think it's in those basic terms, it's really easy to understand.
Thank you for showing that it is not. Okay.
When I was first introduced to anarchist thought, I had a really hard time reading Noam Chomsky. It's so hard for me to just get through the academic language, and I tried to read Emma Goldman, and I did. I read Anarchism and Other Essays, and it was, and still is, hard for me to relate to those texts, because they're so, one, they're so academic, and two, they're really different cultural understanding and perspective of the world than where I come from, which is to say that they are Eurocentric, and it's very clear that anarchism, through its history and through its roots, is Eurocentric. the way that I sort of like to, I actually have this, I've had this sort of drive for a while to confront not only anarchists but radicals in different spaces, particularly at anarchist book fairs. I went to the Bay Area Anarchist Book Fair a few years ago and haven't been invited back since, but that was because our workshop was confronting white privilege and addressing indigenous and indigenous resistance and anarchism. And the reality is today that we have many conflicts with radical, and we should, as indigenous people, confront and hold accountable folks who identify as radical or particularly anarchist for a number of reasons. And one being that maybe I'll sort of illustrate it this way. So I don't know what could be like the ideal or sort of utopian visions for the anarchist future, but if you look at the sort of trajectory today and the paths that things are on, or if you go to like sort of the anarchist hubs and the different communities where you have anarcho-primitivists or anarcho-feminist thoughts, or other groups that have come together, you sort of see like, okay, maybe a future could be well, we don't have food, there's no food not bombs because everybody's planting their urban gardens, or maybe there's no cities because civilization has collapsed and there's loose groups and of autonomous communities that are working together and have their community gardens, and we don't need food not bombs because there's no bombs. People have abolished them, and we don't have prisons. We have transformative or restorative justice models that are practicing, and we have we don't need info shops. Because we don't have the information is more freely flowing through our communities, and we don't need to worry about Walmarts or any of these corporate entities because we're not dependent upon them for our food source. We've smashed the state to the point where there is no state, and we're self-governing, and whatever else we can think of. I'm using some very simple sort of quintessential examples or some basic examples that you sort of find. So you keep sort of imagining this utopian future based upon the projects or autonomous zones and centers and how they could sort of spread and come about. And maybe the insurrectionary anarchists have been successful enough to test all their theories, and they've now established their zones, and here we are. And what is this utopia? And then now we've envisioned that, we've found that, but then the question I ask is, whose land are you on? Where are you living? You've gone through this practice, but have you truly recognized, and especially if this sort of vision has been come to realization here in the so-called United States, then if that vision is on top or has countered this colonial structure of the U.S., then where are the indigenous people? Have they, in that vision of utopia, have they been forgotten? And is this new autonomous vision of the world now imposing itself upon the indigenous peoples who have truly inhabited this land and have faced colonization and now face neo-colonialism, but projected out or extended outward as this sort of utopian autonomous movement? And I state that because when I read all of these books written by white folks or other folks, their visions of the future aren't articulated in a way that relate to our relationship to our natural environment and where we come from as indigenous people, and the fact that all of these institutions are on our lands, and any type of movement for meaningful self-determination on these lands as for indigenous people has to be done in a way that's with meaningful relationship and an understanding of where we come from and where we stand. Yeah, I think those are challenges that the radical movements or scenes and anarchism particularly has to come to terms with in places where it's still an occupational force. So if there's no meaningful relationship to the indigenous people whose land that you're on, you're still a colonial force. I was at a, for some reason I think that most of the interesting discussions around anarchism just happens at the book fairs, which is unfortunate because I think that's a statement on where anarchism is today. It's either relegated to book fairs or info shops or some corner of some place in a rack of zines and I don't know where else, maybe online, infoshop.org and wherever else CrimeThink has planted themselves as well. I think that's so with that stated, at one of the recent LA anarchist book fairs, there was a discussion on spirituality and anarchism, and I think that's something that anarchism has to come to terms with in order to relate, if it wants to, or anarchists, particularly if they want to relate to other struggles, particularly indigenous people struggles. I think, I don't know too many anarcho-Christians. I always thought that was an interesting phenomenon as far as how they, sort of come to terms with their relationship to Christianity and concepts or, the ideologies of anarchism itself, particularly. I personally don't feel like I could ever relate to Christianity on any level, no matter what its, political reworkings could look like, because of its brutal past and what it still hasn't come to terms with today, as far as being a colonialist, agent or agency, or really, and beyond that, being one that has been born out of the domination, subjugation of indigenous peoples, first in Europe and then now globally, so maybe there's some spirit there. I don't know. But I think that's an interesting discussion that needs to continue is what is the spirit of anarchism? Is there one? If we identify as anarcho-indigenous or indigenous anarchists, then what role does our spirituality, because there's no separation in our spiritual practice as Dene or as indigenous people and our life. When I say our culture, when I say spirituality, I don't mean religion, because anything can be religious, but when it comes down to our spiritual identity, it's really establishes who we are in relationship to our cosmology. So with that said, if we extract, or if our spirituality is in contradiction or contradictory towards anarchism or anarchist thought, which, if we look at Marxism, then it's directly in contradiction to that. If there is room for, or space, I should say, for that, sort of engagement, then there's space for indigenous people relating to anarchism and I guess broader anarchist ideologies as well and practices. But I think that's something that's an interesting dialogue that I'd like to talk to other people about. But really, I don't know many other indigenous anarchists or anarcho-indigenous identified folks. I have some friends that have affinities as well, or who identify as more anarcho-primitivist, because we recognize that a lot of indigenous people recognize that colonization has brought civilization, and civilization is unhealthy for our people, and that we don't like that. Primarily we reject the term, or I don't speak for everybody, because I don't think we're identified as groups or movements, as far as like the anarcho-indigenous or indigenous anarchist identified folks. But I think that discussions with anarcho-primitivism is that we reject the term primitivist or primitivism, because we're not primitive. We believe that our traditional practices are, in contrast to, so-called Western, medicine with surgeries and all of these other, pumping people full of pills and medication, things like that. That's barbaric. That's primitive compared to our, practices with just looking at the, Mother Nature as a pharmacy and, utilizing what's, in our natural environment. But these discussions are interesting and help us grow and shape who we are a little bit more and sharpen ourselves as well. But the spirituality for us, is who we are. So if we identify as anarcho-indigenous, we bring that, and that we either embrace it, but I don't know how it conflicts or works with contemporary anarchist thought and practice. Anarchism, to me, the way I identify it, or have come to sort of understand it, as really self-determination, mutual aid, collectivism, basically not taking more than you need. So anti-capitalism, being anti-state, we have no authority beyond or above ourselves. And I think that those are the most important sort of basis. I mean, there's more to that. These are some of the values or the I don't want to say principles, but some of the basis of anarchism as I identify it. I mean, there are more, but for the sort of purposes of just engaging with other folks and having it something digestible and understandable. I mean, there are, of course, when we look at, I think some of the basic principles of direct action, I think that those are really important to understand as far as our relationship to our each other on a meaningful basis, beyond just saying solidarity or that we support you or we support your struggles. Direct action for me is really, it means intervention. It means intervening in the issues that are facing us, particularly issues of oppression and injustice. So that's intervention in the point of destruction. So whether it's desecration of a sacred place for us, or mining, taking something out of the ground, destroying our natural environment, cutting trees, poisoning, polluting our natural environment. The point of production, where they're actually taking the materials and producing something out of it, or producing materials for the war machines, or building prisons. The point of consumption, where people consume products. Those are points of intervention, and there are other points of intervention beyond that. I also consider myself sort of a media activist. I make documentaries myself and work on producing literature and setting up websites and helping develop strategic media campaigns for indigenous communities to address the power structures, and within that we look at the narrative as being a point of intervention as well. So storytelling can be a point of intervention, not just so it's not just about locking down and blockading and stopping a bulldozer from doing something, or locking down in headquarters of some office to try to stop a process or slow it down, or get some attention and put public pressure, community pressure on an issue. But it's actually changing the narrative, or changing the stories, the way that they're being told by dominant society. Because right now, the stories, the narrative is controlled by corporations. In the US, it's controlled by 5 major corporations. I mean, that's who controls the media. So to be able to have our own power and tell our own stories, it's really important. So we do that here with the project that I helped start back in 2004 called Out of Your Backpack Media. And the name is really self-explanatory. It's the fact that you can make a documentary, or you can tell your own stories right now. You can be the media with all the tools that can fit inside a backpack. So it's accessible, it's democratized for the most part. You don't need a lot of money, or you can borrow or steal the equipment that you need to be able to tell your own story. So we have that project where we offer free workshops for Native youth to be able to confront the dominant society's ways of telling the story, and the fact that as indigenous people we're either completely invisibilized, we're completely ignored, or we're completely biased against by the corporate media when we're facing critical issues in our communities. That's one form of intervention or direct action that we have. I'm actually going to trial in next month because I joined some of my friends, some folks who were from migrant communities, the Taala Hooghan people from down on the border of the so-called United States and so-called Mexico areas, and we joined with some anarchist allies, and we locked down in the Border Patrol headquarters down in Tucson, Arizona, to draw attention to border militarization and how the militarization of the border is destroying indigenous communities. And that's something that's largely ignored by the folks who are rallying against racist laws like SB 1070 here in Arizona. A lot of people have heard about that law that criminalizes, further criminalizes people of color, and particularly targets undocumented people. So we wanted to expand that story and say it's not just about these racist laws, because I mean you can change these laws, or we're not looking for nicer laws. We're actually looking to address the root cause of these issues, which really it's about colonialism and capitalism, and how these borders are economic lines, and how free trade agreements like NAFTA and CAFTA have, through their imposition, have allowed multinational corporations to exploit workers to the south and create conditions through subsidizing corn or other agricultural products, and have forced people to migrate up here. So these issues, the root causes of migration, which first of all, migration isn't a problem to begin with. People have been migrating historically, traditionally, culturally for generations upon generations before these colonial states came into these territories. So we took action, direct action, to draw attention to that issue and to put pressure and to challenge the power, not just to say, oh, we're going to send a petition, or not just going to say we're going to rely on these political figures to change their minds, but to confront them and to demonstrate power. Not to say that our lockdown in the Border Patrol headquarters and basically sort of resigning ourselves to be arrested at some point is going to change the conditions that we're faced with, but it's really a demonstration, in some ways symbolic, but it's a taking of power, an owning of power, and demonstrating that we're still here as indigenous people, and that we haven't gone anywhere, and we're going to continue to assert ourselves in a way that is about our self-determination, that is about our struggle for something more than just a human right, or a state right, or a civil right, but it's about our freedoms and our, again, our self-determination. I don't think an anarchist world is the solution. I think that a world where we have come to the understanding of our relationship to each other on a basis of respect and mutual aid. And what I mean by mutual aid is the mutual, or the support for each other on a basis of our understanding of each other's relationships, unique relationships to our natural environment, or social characteristics, or social beings in existence, cultural beings in existence, or individual beings in existence. And with that said, it really comes down to the liberation of our selves, in contrast to all systems of oppression, all forms of domination and control. And that extends not just to us as individuals, or us collectively, depending on the types of groups we have, whether they be cultural or social groups, or beyond, but to our natural environment and to the animals and other beings as well. So I'm very optimistic, because we've had that here in our in this territory, at least, in my elder's lifetime. Like my dad, my father, never went to school until he was 20 years old, and then he was kidnapped from the reservation and forced to go to a boarding school where the boarding school forces tried to assimilate him, beat him when they spoke his language, cut his hair, and he went to school for 3 years. And he always jokes. He said, "Though they tried to teach me how to say yes or no," and he's still trying to learn. But I still have elders on the reservation, on our traditional ancestral homelands, that don't speak any English. They herd the sheep, they raise the sheep, they grow their corn, they make their prayers in the morning, they haul water, they don't have electricity, they don't have running water. They live completely self-sufficient, and they determine their way of life based upon a way that has existence for us since time immemorial. And this is happening right now. So I'm very optimistic that will continue. It's challenging. I mean, in the face of this repressive state, the so-called, one of the so-called greatest superpowers in the world, the United States. I mean, we look at everything that tells us who we should be through mainstream media, through the so-called public education process, through any book that you'll find at the library or in history books, because history is always written by the conquerors. It's a narrative of conquest, so it's hard to find ourselves through that. But then I always am reminded by my elders that here, just again 2.5 hours north of here, in an area known as Big Mountain, an area in Black Mesa, for more than 30 years, they've resisted the laws of the United States, the so-called United States government, and all of the military force that goes behind that law. They've refused to relocate. They've refused to move and accept that law that was passed by Congress in 1974, and they're still there. They've been there for 30 years, and their act of resistance hasn't been, with, tons of guns and, anything that looks like any type of protest that, you typically see. But it's a protest where they've just maintained their way of life. And their form of protest is to haul water, almost every day, is to herd the sheep, let them graze out in the sagebrush fields. It's to, transmit our cultural knowledge to the next generation, and to refuse to let that be assimilated away, to refuse to let the state take that away, to refuse to let the state take the land away. It's to stand when those state forces come, when their agents come, whether it be the police or tribal rangers or federal marshals come, and just to say, no, this is the line and we're going to stay here. And you can't relocate us because we have nowhere to go. This is who we are. And we're going to fight for that. And they've done that successfully for more than 30 years. So for that, I have great optimism. It's challenging because a lot of young people, today it's easy to be despaired. And I'm not surprised when people say they have no hope. I'm not surprised when, especially young people, say they're completely in despair. Because look at what we have to inform us today in dominant society. Everything tells us to be something we're not. Everything tells us to be dependent upon a supermarket or some corporation, and our identities are shaped by these same corporations through corporate media. So I'm not surprised that people feel hopeless and despair. But the more we drive a wedge and we continue to challenge those forces, the more room we make for a better future, for healthy communities, and for not only our culture, because I'm not just speaking for indigenous people here, but for us as whatever you want to call it, humanity, or whatever group you come from, who values the clean environment, who values the respect that it takes to not have the oppression of one group for the benefit of another, whether that be through the manifestation of sexism or heterosexism, or any type of those isms that we face. So yeah, we continue to drive those wedge. We continue to make space, not just to build autonomous zones and be comfortable in anarchist or activist ghettos, or whatever you want to call them, but to look at the smallest opportunity that we have and make that grow. And we have lots of opportunities still, because we're still here as indigenous people, and we've resisted against one of the so-called greatest superpowers and forces that, and in the most violent and the most sickening and disturbing forces and ways that you can imagine. We've existed and survived through attempted genocide, and we're still here. So we'll continue to still be here, and we'll continue to resist.